In this clip, we're going to learn how to edit the particle system properties. So in the last lesson, we had created a particle system and we got a general idea of what each of these categories of properties will do. So let's start to create something like fire. The first thing that we need to do is to modify these properties to get the behavior of the particles themselves. At this point, we're really not too worried about what the particles look like. So the first thing that we'll do is we'll adjust the overall duration. And this is basically going to tell it how long this particle system will live. Now, looking at this, I'll only need this particle system to live for about 1 second. Now, looking at this, you'll notice that there really wasn't any change to the way this was behaving. And the reason for that is because we have looping turned on. Now, from there, we have pre-warm, and what pre-warm is going to do is it's going to make sure that the particle system is already emitting and going whenever the game starts. Otherwise, what would happen is whenever we would press play, these particles would then begin to start emitting, and it would take the player kind of out of the immersion of your game. So in this case, I'm going to make sure that pre-warm is turned on. Now, this is only in case you have something like a fire, which is what we're building, that is already in the scene when it starts. Now, if it's something that you need for the player to interact with and to turn on or turn off, it would make sense to have pre-warm turned off. Now, we'll also have start lifetime, and this is talking about the lifetime of each particle. So in this case, let's go ahead and switch it down to about 1 second, and we'll watch the particles die much sooner. So each particle, the moment that is birthed, it's going to live for 1 second and then it's going to disappear. We have speed, and this is going to determine how fast these particles move throughout space during their lifetime. So if I bump this up to 10, we would see that those particles move much faster and they begin to become a little bit more spread out. Let's go ahead and take that speed to maybe around 2. And we want these to move a little bit slower. We don't want them to flip up into the air quite as much. Now we have the size of these particles, and looking at this, we're at about 1, and I feel like that's pretty good. We might go ahead and switch that up to maybe 2 just to make that look a little bit thicker. And what we're looking at right now, it kind of looks like it could be fire, but it looks a little bit more like smoke. And I think at this time, if we change the shape of the emitter, it might get us pretty close. Let's take a look at the start rotation. The start rotation is just going to determine at what point does the rotation begin on each fire element. Now, if I wanted them to, let's say, rotate a little bit more or even be random, I could click on this little flyout, and you'll notice that there are these flyouts across many of these different parameters. So let's click on the rotation, and you'll see that we get these menu options, and we can change it to a curve, or maybe even a random between 2 constants, which is just a value, and that's actually what we were starting out with, is just a constant. So let's say that I wanted the rotation to just be random. I could say, all right, let's do between a rotation value of 0 and 180 degrees. So anywhere in between there, these particles could actually rotate and start at a rotation value. Let's say that one just comes out at 97 degrees and another one comes out at 27 degrees. That creates a little bit of randomness, and it's a little bit more believable on the particle system itself. Now, we would have to randomize the rotation, and so you either have a value of 0 to 1 in this. So if I typed in 10, you'll notice that it doesn't allow me to do that. Now, this is just kind of like a variance value. So we could really say all of them randomize in their rotation, or we could do 0.5 and say half of them randomize in their rotation. So however you want to set that up. So let's go ahead and do half of them to randomize in their rotation. Now we have the ability to change the start color. Now the color of this is set to white. We know that later on we're going to be using a texture to create the material for this. And what I would want to do is I would want to leave the start color as white, so that way the texture shows up as the actual color of the texture. If I begin to tint this to say something like purple, it would show us the flame with the original orange color, but then it would tint it kind of a purplish color. And I really don't want that. I want that true value in the texture. Now we can add a gravity modifier, and the gravity modifier will cause the particle to raise up and then actually drop down based on this modifier value. So if I did something like 1, you'll see that those particles come up and then they automatically drop down. This would be kind of like a fountain or possibly even fog that's just kind of sticking along the ground here. In my case, I want to make sure that this is set to 0. I don't want fire to be affected by gravity at all. Now the simulation space and speed, the space itself is going to be set to local. So let's say that this particle system gets rotated 45 degrees in one direction. By using these local space, it's going to make sure that the particles are actually emitting in that 45-degree angle. If we were to switch this to world, then it's always going to orient to the world location or direction, even if we were to rotate it. In this case, I'm just going to leave it as local. We have simulation speed, and we can modify how fast these particles play back. And this is just kind of like a multiplier. So if I change this, we're basically going to play the particle simulation at 2 times speed. In my case, I'm just going to leave it at 1. The delta time, we're going to leave it as scaled. This is basically just going to determine if we wanted to have the particle system pause or something like that. But I'm just going to go ahead and leave them as they are and scaled. Then the scaling mode, making sure that it's local or world again. And this is very important to us because we want to be able to play the particle system as soon as the game starts. Now, if you had something that was controlling this particle system, let's say by a script, then you would want to make sure that this is turned off. If we want it to always play, make sure that it's on play on awake. Now, the emitter velocity is based on rigid bodies, and I'm just going to leave that alone. We are not going to be applying any velocity to this to base it off of physics. But if we did, let's say that we had a ball that was on fire and we wanted these particles to emit and actually inherit the velocity of that object, we would need to use this rigid body. Okay, and it would be taking it from the rigid body of the object that this was parented to. We have max particles. Right now, we're limiting what can be emitted, and so right now this particular particle system can only emit 1,000 particles at once. We also have this auto random seed, and this just ensures that whenever we create multiple particle systems, that whenever it starts, the particles aren't using the exact same pattern of emission and rotation, and so it's going to ensure that everything looks random. Now, beyond the general settings, we have emission, and I'm going to leave the rate just the way that it is. If you want more particles, you can increase the rate over time, but for now, we're just going to leave it at a constant of 10. The shape, in this case, we want to leave it as a cone, but you could try any one of these different shapes. So leaving it as a cone ensures that the particle systems go up and then out. However, I want them to actually go straight up. Now you'll notice that in the shape we didn't have a cylindrical shape, and that's because we could actually modify the cone to be a cylindrical shape. So we can do that just by adjusting the angle of this object. And if we take it down to 0, it's going to make sure that it matches the angle and radius of the emitter. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take that radius down a little bit and make it a little bit smaller. So let's do 0.25 for now. And I feel like the size of my particles are just a little bit too big. So let's go ahead and go back to the start size, and let's go to 1. I feel like we might be pretty good here, maybe even 1.5. And that's starting to feel like fire. Now you have the ability to go through these and modify these parameters, and most of these parameters are going to be self-explanatory. Now we are not going to have enough time to go through all of these parameters, but I would suggest that you begin to experiment. You might think about creating a particle system for smoke and seeing how you can modify the behaviors, perhaps make the particles live a little bit longer and maybe get them to spread out a little bit more. And perhaps you could even cause them to die at a slower rate or even at a random rate. That's completely up to you if you want to begin experimenting. Now, the rest of these, like I said, these can be a little overwhelming, but if you start to expand them, you'll see that there's really not that many parameters in them. And like I said, these categories are pretty self-explanatory as to what they're going to do. Now from here, what I would like to do is I want to make sure that we are using the texture sheet animation. And so this is where we're going to start getting into the overall look of our particle system. And I want to take an entire clip to talk about how to get that look and then how to tweak it based on the material and the look that you've created.